Welcome to Ginny's, where East meets West, and a slice of Eastern philosophy becomes a part of Western thinking. I'm your host, Ginny Gong. Today's guest is a pioneer in the field of film production and reporting. She was one of the first Asian female reporters in the Bay Area back in 1974 and has been producing films about the Chinese American community as an independent filmmaker for more than 35 years. Her films, which include the recent Chinese Couplets, received a Golden Spike Storytellers Award from the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California and the Visionary Award from the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. Her other films include Carved in Silence, Chinatown, The Hidden Cities of San Francisco, and China, Land of My Father. Let's take a look at some excerpts from those productions.
I really didn't know my mother. She spent most of her life hiding who she was, lying about where she came from, how she got here. This woman who provided me with so much, yet gave me so little. What secrets were so dark that the truth had to be concealed?
Just leave me alone. And where I come from, how did I get to America? It's nobody's business. Okay, I just want to understand that I don't have to open it. It's my private life.
It would take half a century and thousands of miles before I'd find answers to those questions.
Cuba? When did he go to Cuba?
I was at that point 50 years old and had never heard this story.
To me, I have a father. That means I don't have a father.
Why had she kept this secret from me?
I don't know. There's a goddamn saying so long ago. The question you asked me is silly.
Like Chinese couplets, each verse distinct yet related. Together, they can tell a story, like mothers and daughters.
You see, I buried you in my American school with my practical English because your skin was the color of aged ivory, not quite white enough to melt into the pot.
Oh, you see, very long ago. That's when this story began. The story of a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It's an old neighborhood, as old as San Francisco itself, an American neighborhood. So it's a story about immigrants, about first and second and third generations and so on. Now, in other immigrant communities, after a while, people would begin to move out, get away from the neighborhood. That didn't happen here, not for 100 years. Why? Why did the Chinese stay in Chinatown? That's the story I want you to hear. It's about language, custom, history, and race. They all intersect here, in Chinatown.
But Mock did not cross the Atlantic Ocean. He crossed the Pacific, leaving behind the political turmoil and grinding poverty of his native China. No Statue of Liberty welcomed him at the end of his journey. Instead, he was taken to the immigration station on Angel Island, in the middle of San Francisco Bay.
I ate wind and tasted waves for more than 20 days. Fortunately, I arrived safely on the American continent. I thought I could land in a few days. How was I to know I would become a prisoner suffering in the wooden building? The barbarian's abuse is really difficult to take. When my family's circumstances stir my emotions, a double stream of tears flow.
Like many Chinese immigrants, Lo Wing-sun came under an assumed name. His fear of discovery and possible deportation kept him from talking about his past.
So you're gonna help me put together some pictures?
I'm Felicia Lowe. I was born in America. Lo Wing-sun was my father. When he died, I realized how very little I knew about his life in China, about China itself. And it became clear to me that if I wanted my son Benjamin to learn of his heritage, I needed to go to China to see the land of my father.
Now I need to do this. Okay, this is your Gong Gong. That's your grandpa. Who's this?
Join me in welcoming an accomplished filmmaker and educator who has been making a difference in the Asian Pacific American community for almost 4 decades, Felicia Lowe. Welcome, Felicia.
My pleasure.
Congratulations on such an extensive career, and thank you for coming all the way from the West Coast to us here in the East Coast.
When Jenny calls.
I wish everybody felt that way. What inspired you to pursue this career in journalism and filmmaking? Because it's certainly not a traditional career for an Asian American.
I think I stumbled my way. Partially, I think I used to credit my mother for the fact that whenever I asked her questions about her past, she would never tell me anything. And I think it made me a very curious person. And so I pursued journalism as my initial career, and then eventually went into broadcast journalism. And I really was excited by broadcast because you could reach a lot of people at one time. So that's what got me excited. It's such a dynamic medium.
Right, right. Now, you know, Asian parents, particularly Chinese parents, are not always supportive of their children pursuing careers in the arts, right? Where's the stability?
I have to credit my parents also for not stopping me from doing it. Okay. And I must say that once I was on the news and a reporter, they very much felt a lot of pride in seeing me up there on the screen, and especially when their friends complimented them for their daughter's work.
Right, right, right. Oh, that's one way to look at it, right? Now, when you're doing these projects, how do you make decisions about what projects to, undertake? Because it certainly seems that some of your projects are rather personal in nature.
Well, they're also historical. When I was growing up, certainly, I think most of us in my generation were taught American history, American meaning primarily Eurocentric history. So the stories of the landing of at Plymouth Rock and it was difficult to relate to as a little Chinese girl. Right. And onward, the stories that we were taught rarely reflected anything about our own history here in America. Sure, maybe one line about the railroad workers, but very little else. And so as I put together my own yearning to learn more about our history in America, where we fit into the tapestry of the history of America, it became a motivating factor in terms of tracking my own parents and how they got here and what happened to the people before. And therefore, I happen to have the skill set to be allowed to make these films. So I did the first one, China, Land of My Father, where I went back to China to meet my paternal grandmother for the first time, and that was in 1979. And what I found when it showed on PBS was that our stories are universal stories. The human condition is universal. There's more we share alike than differences, but we have our specific differences. So I was very well pleased to hear people say, I went to Poland and experienced exactly the same thing, having met family. There's just something indescribable when you walk into a house of a grandmother who, up to that moment, was a picture of a little old lady, in a black and white picture, and to walk into this home and to see photos of yourself on the walls.
Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of what you've done have really been educational in purpose. Because it's very important to make sure people understand where are we coming from, right? What's our history? How do you feel that you've achieved that goal, that educational piece of it?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I'm not saying it in a prideful way, but it does give me a lot of satisfaction, the reason why I transitioned to making documentaries and longer format film pieces versus the 90-second pieces I did as a reporter was that it would have more staying power. It could be used in classrooms. So the second film I made, Carved in Silence, which really documents the experiences of the immigrants who crossed the Pacific during the enforcement of the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1910 to 1940 in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the walls talk. I mean, immigrants were detained there for such a long time that they carved poems on the walls. And so that piece has been used in classrooms and universities to this day, even though the film was made in 1988. I mean, it was such a remarkable place, you know, though it's sometimes dubbed the Ellis Island of the West. The remarkable difference is that it was set up to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the only time in American history where a group was ethnically, racially denied entry, banned from coming to this country, and it casts a very long shadow on our communities.
Well, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought because we need to take a short break, and we'll come back and talk about this important piece of history in greater depth, okay? It's time for us to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Packers.
Viking.
Packers.
Viking.
Viking.
Red state. Blue state. Vegan.
Carnivore.
We come from different places.
Uptown.
Downtown.
Optimist.
We come to different conclusions.
Half empty.
Half full.
But when we live united, we create real, lasting change in the building blocks of life. The education, income, and health of our communities,
Live.
our families,
United.
even the person next to us.
Live united.
Real change won't happen without you. So give, advocate, volunteer, live united. Sign up at liveunited.org.
In the small town of Elmira, New York, a boy was born into an all-American family. The odds of him achieving his dream in the fashion industry? 1 in 23 million. The odds of having a child diagnosed with autism? 1 in 110. I am Tommy Hilfiger, and my family is affected by autism. Learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs.
If you drive buzzed, it could cost you around $10,000. You'll face major legal fees, major fines, and steep insurance penalties. You could lose everything. Nothing kills a buzz like getting pulled over for buzz driving, because buzz driving is drunk driving.
Welcome back to Ginny's, where East meets West. My guest today is Felicia Lowe, independent filmmaker for more than 3 decades. Felicia, before you made the long-form documentaries, you were a field producer. How did that impact your future work into the films that have really been what you've been most recognized for?
They were done in incremental steps in that as a street reporter, general assignment reporter, I would do 90-second pieces, sometimes 30-second pieces, occasionally, a series. But they were still very brief, and I was hungry to do stories that had a little more lasting value and impact. So I became a field producer freelance and worked on different shows. One was about the changing role of men and women in the late 70s. That case, I talked about insurance or Hasidic women, different aspects of life as it was lived then, as men and women tried to become more equal partners in life. And so I was able to then make pieces that were 10 to 20 minutes long. Yeah. So when the opportunity for me to go to China, and we're talking about 1979, when China was just opening up, I thought what a wonderful opportunity to see if it was at all possible to meet this grandmother who had, as I said before, only been a picture of a little old lady, And so I joined a group of journalists and we traveled to China. And the thing about that trip, because it was very much done almost like a street reporter would handle it. I never knew where the plugs were going to be when I went there. We had to really shoot by the seat of our pants and just document the interactions between the Chinese people and myself. So from that standpoint, in every way, my training as a reporter and a journalist
was
informed my ability to make that particular film.
And make films you did, and a few of your major works I'd like to talk about in a little greater detail. Let's start with Carved in Silence. If you could, tell us basically what your whole focus was for that film, and where it went from there.
Yeah. Well, I actually have developed a huge attachment and I don't know almost responsibility about that story. Angel Island Immigration Station was built in 1910 and was operating till 1940. As I mentioned earlier, it was built specifically to enforce these Chinese exclusion acts. After I made the film, did I realize that my own father had gone through Angel Island, as did a grandfather. But again, like so many immigrants who went through there, they never talked about that experience. And it was such a gaping hole in our history and in the understanding of how what were the effects of exclusion? What did that mean? Well, one, instead of going through Ellis Island,
which
2
is
or
where
3
my father
hours,
came from.
But and he undoubtedly went through a very short interrogation, but at that time, most Europeans, and 80% were from Europe, went through in and out of Ellis Island for 3 to 5 hours. They were in and out. Whereas at Angel Island, the typical stay was 2 or 3 weeks. And in some rare instances, there were even documentation of people who were waiting for appeal and stayed there for 2 years.
Wow.
So in that time period, people were held and very feeling many different emotions, but those were expressed on the walls through carvings.
Right, carved, right. Let's go to Chinatown, Hidden Cities in San Francisco. What was that about?
Well, what was very commonplace, of course, is after you left Angel Island, the place you would likely go to is a Chinatown, because again, because of discrimination at that time, Chinatowns were the safe havens.
Right.
And they were scattered throughout California and across the country, but because of the attitudes toward Chinese, Chinatowns were the safe place to go, and that's where your community services were available and your family name associations and the regions and so forth. And so the idea in terms of doing Chinatown was to tell that story in a poetic way also, letting people know, one, that the reason why those Chinatowns survive, and San Francisco is one of the oldest Chinatowns in the whole country, is because of all the small storekeepers and all the people in the community who wanted to make a parallel world that made it comfortable if you didn't speak English right away, if you didn't, that you could buy the kinds of foods that you wanted to use and the ingredients and so forth. But really showed their resilience. They would not be victimized. They took control and made their own world.
Was it really hidden? I mean, hidden in plain sight, kind of?
Well, hidden in the sense. I mean, I think that people get one facade of Chinatown, right? The lights and the buildings with the pagoda, and the food and all of that. But behind all of those stories are really the people who make it work. And I think that that's what I was trying to get at, that behind these stories, who are the storekeepers and who are these people who do small things in a great way?
Now, the latter two are really very personal. You went from there to China, Land of My Father. What about that film?
Well, China, Land of My Father was done, they're really kind of bookends on either end of my career, actually, because the first was China, Land of My Father. The more recent one, Chinese Couplets, is really about my mother's journey to this country. And she came in 1937. She did not come through Angel Island, but instead through Hawaii. And the story about exclusion also includes lots of secrets and silence. one of the things that was very profound about the whole Exclusion Act was that there was a very narrow exempt class where people were allowed to come. And they were educators and scholars and merchants and citizens and their minor-aged children. Well, China was an agrarian country, so there were very few who fit in that category. However, and because of the 1906 earthquake, something that is known within the community but not so much outside, is that all the vital records were burned in San Francisco. So many of the immigrants who were living here then, and mostly men, could claim that they were a citizen, and there was no way to disprove that they weren't. So this allowed them and gave them the piece of paper that would allow them to go back to China and then return and come back and forth, and also to claim their children.
Claim children, right.
And so that paper, if you came as a minor-aged child, it was your passport to get to America.
Right.
And as America has always been in Chinese, Gamsan, Gold Mountain, Scandinavians called it the Promised Land. Every culture has this hope of America.
Yeah.
So it created a black market, if you will, of papers for mostly for boys. But my mother and her sister were able to come to this country. My aunt and my grandmother actually turned out to be in functioning, though married, was a single mom because my grandfather was in Cuba, which was all part of the discovery of my mother's story, which she had kept tight-lipped about, but opened up to my daughter. And through,
not to you,
not
to
to
your
me,
daughter.
to my daughter. And through those interviews my daughter did with her, and then once she opened up, then I was prodding her a little bit more, and she opened up more, and then eventually I took her back to China, to the village she had left, 7 decades earlier. And out of that unraveled the story of how my grandmother had the gumption to try, and was so serious about getting 2 daughters out of China during war-torn years, that she found a family leaving China and safety, whose own daughter had died.
Wow.
And she convinced this family to take her own daughter in the dead daughter's place.
Wow. Wow.
This is a story you cannot make up.
Yeah. No, well, there are a lot of stories that you really have to wonder about.
Well, I think that it shows how desperate people were, and also how a mother will do anything to save their child.
Yeah.
But it was this story that my mother could not tell, or was very frightened to say, share that story. Partly, I think, out of fear that maybe we'd all be deported, even though I was born in America. And I think also it was hard for many people who came through those bumpy times to look back, because there was a lot of pain attached to it.
Yeah, a lot of pain in thinking about what happened.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly seems like in your film that you were able to compress 5,000 years of Chinese history, into like 150 years of American history in this one film of yours, this 60 minutes.
Well, it's a human story, and it's our story. I have the specifics, but really I feel that my stories are very typical, or share a lot of the same similarities to many children of paper sons and daughters, because our families didn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. And in a way, how do we get past it unless we open up those wounds and look at it?
What's the relevance then to today's immigration discussions?
Well, I think, one, absolutely, that we should know that exclusion and the idea of isolating people happened before. There's a real threat of it happening again.
Yeah.
And that those of us who know that history and know the consequences of it need to really respect and perhaps, lend our voices to it. There is a time when silence becomes betrayal. And I'm quoting Martin Luther King, who said it much more eloquently, but silence can be betrayal if you know what that can cost. Yeah. Then I feel we have an obligation to say something about it.
So I'm going to close by quickly asking you, is there another project in the works?
Well, I have 2 or 3 that I'd really love to do, but the one that's closest at the top of the list is something called Shirley's Trousseau. I inherited a trunk of clothing that was the hope chest of a young woman named Shirley Chan, who passed away in 1943. And in this hope chest were Chinese dresses she had made and Western dresses and linens. And what was startling about it is that it was passed around in her family untouched, so it's a time capsule.
So you're going to have a lot of fun going
yes,
through
I'd
it
love
all.
to. Well, the dresses are beautiful, but I'd love to bring together a multidisciplinary group of artists, a choreographer, a musician, poet, dancers, to interpret the trunk as they see fit. I think that would really be a fun thing to do.
Well, we wish you a lot of luck in doing that, Felicia. Thank you for joining me. We've run out of time, so I want to thank my guest, Felicia Lowe, for joining us, and look forward to the next
Shirley's
product,
Trousseau.
Shirley's Trousseau. That concludes our program today. Thanks again to Felicia Lowe for sharing her decades of work in educating audiences about the Asian Pacific American community. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Stay well, and we'll see you next time.